So for today's guided notes, we're going to go over lesson 5.2, which is the evidence of evolution. So in Darwin's book, which we talked about in the previous section of notes, Darwin argued that living things have been evolving on Earth for millions of years, and the following is the evidence that he presented in his findings. So the first one we're going to talk about is the fossil record. We're going to talk about how geographical distribution helps to show evolution, explain what homologous structures are and how they show evolution. We're going to analyze some similarities in early development, otherwise known as embryology, to show evidence for evolution. And the last thing we're going to talk about is the comparison of genetic information and how that shows evidence for evolution. So the first one is the fossil record. So you guys, I'm sure, are familiar with fossils, and Darwin saw these fossils that were recovered in the ground as a record of history of life on Earth. Essentially, scientists are able to document how life on Earth has changed over time by comparing fossils from older layers of rock with fossils from the younger layers. And you can see from these fossils in these pictures that the living organisms we see today, just outside, look a lot different than what we are finding from the fossil layers. So living things have had to have changed over time in order to have what we have today. We don't have dinosaurs walking around anymore. But we do have living things that have similar bone structure to what we're finding in the fossil evidence of dinosaurs. And that can lead us to understand some of the relationships between a series of living organisms. The next case for evolution is geographical distribution. So what this means is that species that live on different continents most likely descended from different ancestors. So they did not all descend from the same ancestor. They're, however, exposed to similar pressures of natural selection. This is Darwin's biggest point for his evidence of natural selection, that even though these organisms were not descended from the same common ancestor, they still appeared similar in size and in color. If you look here, we've got the examples of the beaver, the muskrat, the coypu, and the capybara. They're all very similar in color. They have a similar nose shape, similar ear size, similar body size. There are some differences in their feet and in their tails, but the reason they look the way they do, Darwin proposed, is because they were exposed to similar pressures of natural selection. So different animals end up evolving similar features because in the places that they live, those are good features for survival. So the process of natural selection worked the same on these different creatures that were evolved from different ancestors. The next type of evidence, homologous body structures, is sort of the opposite. So this states that structures that have different mature forms, meaning they look different once they're fully developed, actually develop from the same embryonic tissues. So these are called homologous structures. So in this picture, we have a human arm, a cat front leg, a fin of a whale or a dolphin, and then the wing of a bat. And if you were to take away the x-ray image and look at these just on the surface, they all look incredibly different, and they seem to have very different purposes. But on analysis of the bone structure, each of these color-coded pieces actually develop from the same type of tissue early in the development of this organism, when it's in embryo stage, meaning it's still inside its embryo stage was right after the egg is fertilized by the sperm, so when it's still inside the womb or an egg, when it's still developing. So this points to a recent common ancestor. If they still have similar body tissues that develop maybe into different functions, that still points to they had a close relative somehow. So not all homologous structures, so no, the answer is no, they do not all serve an important function. many organs in different animals are so reduced in size that they are just traces of homologous organs in other species. These are called vestigial organs. A really popular example of this is the appendix in humans. The appendix in humans is sort of the leftovers, if you will, of evolution, and our evolutionary ancestors had a much larger structure in their intestines that helped to digest raw meat, which we no longer eat. We cook our meat, therefore our appendix is much more reduced in size because it's not needed. In this other fossil picture of a whale, you can see that they actually have tiny little hip bones inside their big fat bodies that have zero purpose whatsoever. They're just leftovers from the times of the ancestors of the whales who actually did have legs and walked on land. So these vestigial organs that serve no purpose at all give a lot of really strong evidence that evolution has occurred, because otherwise, why would they even be there? They serve no purpose. The next type of evidence is similarities in embryology. And embryology is the study of early development. So the early stages of embryos in many animals, specifically many animals that have a backbone, are very similar. In these embryos, it shows evolution because the same groups of embryonic cells develop in the same order and in similar patterns, kind of like how the homologous structures develop. So if you look at these two pictures, we have on the left a chicken embryo and on the right a human embryo. And they have a lot of things in common. They both have a tail at the end, right here and right here. Pharyngeal pouches, which the arrows seem to be a little off here, but the pharyngeal pouches are here and here, which in both chickens and humans will give rise to the lungs that are going to end up breathing in air. But they also have, see, the backbone here is very similar shape and structure as well in early development, which means that the humans and the embryo, the human embryo and the chicken embryo, have a very recent common ancestor. The very last form of evidence for evolution, and also the strongest form of evidence, is genetic evidence. So the recent advances in the field of genetics has led to these stronger forms of evidence. The way that genetic evidence shows evolution is that organisms with many similarities in their genetic code are more closely related than those with fewer similarities. So we can actually analyze our relationship to other living things based on the amount of differences we find in the genetic code. And that's what this data table is showing us on the right. This data table is called a molecular clock, and what that is it counts up the number of differences in the amino acids that differ from humans and other animals on this list. And the more differences there are, the longer they have been evolving separately. So the less closely related they are. So if you see down here, the lamprey has 125 differences between humans and the lamprey, which means that the lamprey and the human split off from their evolution much longer ago than the human and the rhesus monkey, which has only 8 differences. So with that analogy too, we would say that the mouse, which has 27 differences, is more closely related to the human than the chicken, which has 45 differences. And the frog is more closely related to the human than the lamprey. So counting up the number of differences, which would be caused by mutations, gives us an idea of how long these living things have been evolving separately from one another. And that's it for the evidence.